This is the second session, Battle for Social Ideas, The Strand, entitled Poverty, Why Isn't It History Yet? I just wanted to thank our partners, Why Poverty and the Intelligent Optimist, for sponsoring this session. To my immediate right is Daniel Banami, who is a writer and journalist. An extended version of his latest book, Ferraris for All, was published this year. He's currently working on a project on the widespread fear of inequality. Brian Hill, sitting here to my immediate left, is an award-winning director of documentary and drama. His films mainly have a strong sense of social justice. He's the MD of an acclaimed production company, Century Films. He's currently working on the forthcoming Storyville Why Poverty, and he's primarily doing a documentary, Welcome to the World. Jonathan Portes, who is the director of the National Institute of Economic and Social Research. Like me, you probably would have heard Jonathan at numerous interviews, seen him on television, read about him in the newspapers, commenting on the current situation with the economy, on austerity, all sorts of issues. And previous to this job, he was the chief economist at the Cabinet Office. In 1981, there were 70% of people living in the developing world subsisted on the equivalent of less than $2 a day, and 42% had to manage with less than $1 a day. Today, however, in 2012, 43% are below $2 a day, and 14% are less than $1 a day. The report went on to say that the extent of improvement is everywhere. And for the first time since 1981, it claimed that we have seen less than half the population of sub-Saharan Africa living below 125 a day. So you could say there's much to celebrate. China, India, other parts of Southeast Asia, even Africa, Brazil, are all experiencing drops in poverty rates. While there's much to celebrate about the developing countries, there is, however, a lot of concern and worry about the situation in the West. The latest census figures in America, for instance, showed that the numbers of Americans living in poverty jumped to 49.1 million, or 16% of the total population. Here in Britain, we have similar stories. I read recently that the number of UK poor receiving emergency food aid has doubled in the last 6 months. The previous Labour government had set a target to eliminate poverty by 2020. 10 years ago, 3.4 million people lived in poverty here. Now there's worry that the austerity measures the current coalition government is implementing will take us back quite a few years. There's so much worry that there's been a lot of debate and discussion. For instance, why are we giving aid to India, to Brazil, or even, as I found out, to China? Perhaps not us, but Europe included. A recent poll by ICM for the Sunday Times made out that 70% of people questioned about overseas aid said it should be scaled down. The discussion actually has meant that I think the UK government was going to enshrine in law that 0.7% of gross national income was to be contributed as aid. They've now delayed making that decision to 2015. So clearly in this country, there's quite a lot of questions and debates about this issue. Take the question about us giving India aid. Last year, I think we gave more than 280 million to India. Now, India is a rapidly developing country. It's got a lot of claimed international, companies operating internationally. It's got even its own space program. So I'm interested to see whether you think we should continue giving aid, certainly to India. Let's stick with India for the moment.
I mean, I won't give a yes or no, but I do think it's that one should step back a bit and say that just because parts of India are relatively rich and because India is developing, doesn't in itself mean that we shouldn't be giving aid to India. India has, I suspect, still far more poor people than any individual country, other individual country in the world. It has very high levels of malnutrition, of female illiteracy, of all the sorts of things that were targeted under the Millennium Development Goals and have been successfully attacked in a number of countries. And we do have a reasonable good idea of what to do about those sorts of problems. And the United Kingdom Department for International Development, while far from perfect, is one of the most respected and most efficient development agencies in the world. So I would say that if what we're doing is simply freeing up money within the Indian government budget for them to do other things, then it's not a particularly good use of money. If, however, our money combined with our expertise, our influence and our help can get the Indian government to do the things which collectively it's actually pretty bad at doing, and we know that while some states in India are extremely well governed, some are extremely badly governed, and in some states that the social support systems really function very badly. If our aid actually helps those at a state and local level to develop those support systems which will help get people out of poverty, then I think it is worth doing.
First, very briefly to say something about India, I think I'm right in saying that there are more poor people in India than in the whole of sub-Saharan Africa. I mean, roughly speaking, they've got the same population. India, I think, is about 1.1 billion. Africa, probably approaching 1 billion in population. So it's clearly true you do have some Indian billionaires, you do have some middle-class people in India, and you do have economic growth in India, which is great. But India, on the whole, is a very, very poor country. In fact, I've got some notes here. It's poorer than say, Angola and Egypt, which you might think are poorer than India because you hear all this stuff about the Indian miracle and everything. So, of course, those countries are much smaller than India population-wise. But in terms of income per head, India is still very far down the league table. So it is a very poor country in aggregate, in total. On the main question on aid, I mean, my view is very strongly that there is no such thing as aid, that it is a complete myth. If by aid you mean some kind of altruistic payment by the West to poorer countries. Because when the West gives aid, it's always motivated by its own concerns and preoccupations. So during the Cold War, aid was very much motivated by geopolitical concerns about containing the Soviet Union and containing radical political movements and so on. Clearly that's gone now. But it seems to me aid now is very much about the self-image of the West, about making the West feel good that it's playing a benevolent kind of role in the world. And it very often has very tight strings attached to it in line with that. And very often, and I haven't got time to go into details now, but happy to answer questions on it, very often it's allied to a conception which is about limiting development, which is saying, well, it's not really realistic for poor countries to develop as we have done in the West. What you've got to do is to really limit your ambitions. Don't build so many bridges. Don't have a space program if you're India. Just concern yourself with things like making sure that the men in your country don't beat the women in your country. You have to have all these programs to do with regulating the family, regulating interpersonal relations. That's what a lot of aid is moving towards, led by organisations like DFID. So I think if I was the economics minister, say, development minister of India, and I was asked, should I carry on taking aid, I'm moving towards the view now that they should probably refuse aid. I mean, probably if there's an emergency, they should take emergency relief. But aid from the West comes with so many dangerous, damaging strings attached that they're probably better off not taking it and trying to develop on their own without Western so-called aid and charity.
I think that's quite a cynical view of aid. And although I agree that there are occasions and there have been instances when Western governments and Western agencies do attach conditions and do have some self-interest, I don't think that would generally apply to all aid. And certainly in India, India does have 1/3 of all the malnourished children in the world. And a child that's malnourished for the first 1,000 days of its life is considered to be stunted. And that is irreparable. You cannot, if you spend the first 1,000 days of your life not getting nourishment, or the correct nourishment, then you will spend the rest of your life earning less, learning less, and the quality of your life will be damage forever, and you can't change that. So just in terms of a very practical, I mean, I think there's a moral sense in which we should give aid, but I think in a very practical sense it's in our interest that the 180 million children in the world who are stunted as of now, that figure doesn't grow and continue, because those people become, if you nourish people, if you give them the means to progress, then they become economically active and they make a contribution that they couldn't necessarily otherwise make because of lack of nourishment in their early lives. So I think it's a practical and a moral imperative that we give aid to people.
I don't think that we're saying that we would or should say to India, you shouldn't be building bridges, but I do think it wouldn't be a terribly good use of public money here to help the Indians build bridges or roads. They're quite capable of doing that on their own. They have enough money, they have enough the expertise and all the rest of it. I think, however, it is quite reasonable actually for us to say to the Indians that we know that educating girls has the following effects. We know how to do a randomized control trial that will say whether in fact this program works better than that program in getting more girls into school. And we will fund these sorts of programs in your country and help you to develop these programs and expand that. That is something where we actually do have a comparative advantage that does not strike me as being either moral or economic imperialism.
One of the ways poverty is viewed is in relation to income and wealth. Now, today there's a lot of discussion about the widening inequalities in each country. And if anything, the focus, if you like, has been on the widening inequalities as opposed to perhaps poverty in the way a lot of us have understood and discussed it. I'm really interested to see what your take is on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a lot of confusion, even on a basic statistical level, about this, maybe because a lot of people are not so good at maths. They assume, for example, that if you have widening inequality, if that is the case, then absolute living standards must be falling. And it, just as a basic mathematical fact, that isn't the case. I mean, it seems to me that if you look at the broad trend in the developing world, it's clear that poverty is decreasing. If you define poverty in absolute terms, so if you take a threshold like $1 a day or $2 a day, and you can argue with those thresholds and exactly what they are, what they represent, but if you take a threshold, then the number of people living in poverty on a global level is decreasing. And that is a really, really positive thing, and that is something we should celebrate and something we shouldn't lose sight of. Inequality is trickier because you can measure it in all sorts of different ways, and you can have inequality widening by some dimensions and narrowing in other dimensions. So maybe just take one country, China, as an example to illustrate what I'm talking about. Real incomes in China since the late 70s, when they started opening up to the rest of the world, real incomes in China have increased tenfold, which is on average, which is an incredible increase in people's average standard of living, really, really positive. At the same time, China has become a lot more unequal because some people's living standards have increased quite a lot. Some people have become billionaires. So at the same time as poverty decreasing quite dramatically, inequality in China has widened quite dramatically. Those things are not, mathematically speaking, contradictory. In fact, they both have happened. Also, at the same time, and by another dimension, you have a narrowing of global inequality. Because if you think, if China has, roughly speaking, 8% growth compounded over 30 years, and say the West is growing by, for the sake of argument, 2% a year compounded over 30 years, then by that dimension, the gap between the West and China is narrowing quite dramatically. So you have quite a lot of different things happening in relation to inequality and poverty. But I would say the broad trend, speaking globally, is for poverty to decrease, and that is a very, very positive thing.
Inequality is interesting. I found out recently that Bridgeport in Connecticut in the United States is a more unequal society than Zimbabwe in terms of the economic difference between the top and the bottom income groups. And I think there's lots of research now that saying that societies that are more equal, that have a smaller gap between the richest and the poorest, are happier places to be, are places where people thrive, where people are happier and less prone to anxiety and stress. And of course we always look at Scandinavia to and admire what's happening there for that. And certainly reducing inequality is one way to reduce poverty. But it's also, as Daniel says, it's certainly increasing in China and in India and Brazil and all sorts of places, so that some of the problems that we now have in the West and that we associate with inequality in the West are starting to surface in those countries that are just developing.
I agree with pretty much everything that Daniel said, and in particular that the global trends on both inequality and poverty are on poverty are certainly very good. On an inequality are, once you add it all up, probably not too bad. But sort of taking that into a normative sense, the context of inequality matters a lot. So I think it would be lunatic to say that the economic development of China that we've seen over the last 30 years has been bad for humanity, or in particular for people who live in China, just because inequality has gone up a lot. That's something that maybe we should worry about. It's certainly something the Chinese government are themselves worried about. But it would be mad to say, we'd just be better off if they were back in the 1960s. On the other hand, when you have inequality growing significantly at a time when incomes overall are not growing that fast, and when the result is that actually incomes at the bottom are growing slowly or not at all, and incomes at the top are growing extremely fast, which is broadly what we've seen in large parts of the West, especially the US and the UK, then you do worry very much more about it. So in the US, for example, virtually all of the income gains of the last 20 years have gone to the top 5 or 10%, and within that, quite a large proportion of that have gone to the top 1% or even the top 0.1%, with the exception of the Clinton years where there was a little bit of broad-based income growth. Most people at or below median incomes in the US have not seen very much income growth at all. The UK has not been that bad. What we saw here was a very sharp rise in inequality in the between, say, the late 70s and the mid-90s. But since then, it's been much more equal for most of us, with the exception of the fact that, again, the top 0.1% have done extremely, extremely well. So how much should we worry about these things? I think actually in the developed country context, one does have to worry them about them quite a lot. We are not talking about the same kinds of problems that Brian was quite likely referring to in that children being persistently malnourished for years because of simple lack of money. That doesn't happen very much here. But there is quite a wide variety, as Brian again alluded to, of social and in the medium-run economic problems that build up if you have that degree of inequality persisting over a period of time. And we are certainly in some danger of that at the moment.
The discussion of inequality in the developed countries is very, very problematic, more than people realise, because the way it's generally pitched is we've got to constrain economic growth because of widening inequality. And I would say that's the wrong way to understand things. I think at the moment, in fact, our main focus has to be making society more prosperous, to really focus on that. I've written a book called Ferraris for All, so that kind of gives some indication of where I'm coming from. That everyone, we want more economic growth, and we want everyone to benefit from that. And the apparently radical discussion of inequality at the moment, what people are really saying, if you listen to Warren Buffett, who's this American multi-billionaire who's apparently saying inequality should be narrowed, and he's doing a double act with Barack Obama, who's supporting him. They've got this love-in with each other. What the discussion of inequality in the West at the moment is saying, let's have shared sacrifice. So essentially Warren Buffett is saying, I'll make a bit of a sacrifice, so you, ordinary people, you also have to make sacrifices. So it's really a way of selling austerity, of indirectly attacking economic growth. And it's I would say, a very, very negative discussion, a bit different from the developing world discussion, but a very negative one, I would say.
Do you share that?
In part. I mean, I do think that the idea that people who worry about inequality or relative poverty in the UK context are anti-growth isn't really right. I worked on the child poverty target in government for most of the 2000s, and there was nobody within the British government saying, "Oh, we've got to have less growth so that we'll bring down the measured rate of child poverty because it's all about relative inequality." What people were arguing about and saying was we should redistribute more money from the people who are doing very well to the people who aren't in order to reduce relative poverty. Now, some people could argue that higher rates of tax for rich people would have the implication of reducing growth. I don't personally tend to share that view at current levels of taxation, but it's not an unreasonable argument. But nobody was saying that we should positively reduce economic growth for the sake of reducing poverty. I have more sympathy for Daniel's view in the current context about shared sacrifice. I do, my views on austerity are well known. I do not think that the reason that the justification for taxing the rich more is just so that all the pain is shared. I think that there's a reasonable degree of cross-country evidence that says actually you can both attack poverty and inequality and promote economic growth at the same time, and that's what we should be doing. And I also agree with Daniel at the moment, the primary emphasis actually, which would benefit all of society, but especially those who are towards the bottom, is about getting growth back on track. So on that I agree entirely.
The book that Brian alluded to, The Spirit Level, which basically says, let's not worry about economic growth, let's really, really focus on narrowing inequality. I think this is the way it works in kind of real life, if I could use a horrible phrase, that you have these people writing what is essentially a pretty awful book in many ways, saying that inequality is really damaging. We have all these graphs of correlations to prove that's the case. And then you have it endorsed by both David Cameron and I think it was Ed Miliband, or maybe whoever the previous Labour leader was, I forget now. But the endorsing it and saying, oh, this is a really clever book, this is a really brilliant idea. So that's how it works its way out, not so much in the kind of particular people pursuing or devising policy inside government, but as part of this broader discussion of we need shared sacrifice, isn't growth problematic, doesn't it cause all of this damage?
I mean, I am not opposed to growth. Although I mentioned some ideas in the spirit level, I wouldn't say that you have to just reduce inequality and not have growth. Of course you can. I don't think anybody would argue that we should have a more equal society in their right mind, but that having a more equal society is not incompatible with economic growth. One thing we should certainly be doing is not just looking at ways of taxing, giving higher taxation to very wealthy people, should actually be making sure they pay their taxes anyway, because so many of them don't, or so many of them find ways around it. So that would be one measure that I think would have very popular support.
I was thinking that on a personal level, if I met someone who was so deeply concerned about what everyone else earned, and that really affected their mental state, I would just think that person should get a life. And I'm not sure that we need to be concerned about the level of income equality in our country, because it distracts away from focusing on what our society could actually achieve, rather than just pointing to a number which we say reflects a real aspect of society and say that number should go up or down, to say, well, what actual projects are we as a country involved in?
I just want to make a point on the first question about aid, and specifically India, but I mean this can be applied more generally. Who are you to hold the Indian government to account about how they don't provide social services or reduce income equality themselves? What I think would actually solve that problem is getting our own noses out of their country and actually hoping that the Indians themselves, create a militant labour movement and use democratic means to force their government to focus on building long-lasting infrastructure and proper economic development. I don't believe anyone really gets out of poverty in any meaningful sense or long-term sense by giving aid. And of course, giving aid causes a lot of problems because, in a way it pacifies the population from not holding their leaders to account. And I think, what mandate do you have to sort out their social problems? That relies completely on their, it's their own destiny to achieve. And I think in some ways aid can be part of the problem and not part of the solution.
The time comes for a different political project, for a mass mobilization, for political change. So what do we do in this case? What would be your answer in the dead ends that Greece is facing at the moment?
Okay.
Oh, and also I want to say that I totally agree with our friend over there about leaving Indians alone.
What I'm interested in is the connection between growing inequality in this country and obviously more starkly in the United States, and social mobility and equality of opportunity. I mean, clearly we have in this country even left-wing Labour MPs buy a privileged education for their children rather than let them go to the state system. Not that I'm trying to make a party point, because I'm on the left, but there is this stark contrast in the sense between the inequality that exists, and it seems to be self-perpetuating, it seems to be widening, social mobility seems to be decreasing, equality of opportunity seems to be decreasing.
I think aid has a bad press, and I think some of that bad press is quite justified because it's been administered badly in the past, it's been heavy-handed, and certainly some aid is tied to conditions that are imposed upon a country receiving that aid. But I think about someone like UNICEF and what they do. They don't just put a bag of money down and say, here you are, sort something out. They will go into a country and they'll work with the government. They'll work with a government at regional and national and local level, and they will talk, they'll offer their expertise, and they will devise programs and encourage that government to work with them to solve issues that they have experience of. And I think, aid does work. It can work. Polio has been eradicated in India, partly as a result of aid programs. Mozambique was the poorest country in the world 20 years ago. It's made huge strides forward, and it's cut the infant mortality rate by 20%. The number of children dying before the age of 5 by 20%. So, and I think you can find examples all over the world where aid does have a positive effect. Now, that's not saying that there aren't problems with aid, and particularly about how it's administered, and we should certainly look at those. But to have a blanket aid is wrong, I think, doesn't work. You can only look at specific examples and say, did this work in this particular case?
On social mobility and inequality, the short answer is yes, and I'll refer you to my long article. I'll share it to you later. But I think there clearly is a web of connections between social mobility, inequality, and the equality of educational opportunity. It doesn't follow that things are necessarily getting worse because there's too much of a lag in the statistics. What we do know is that social mobility fell in this country over the 80s and 90s. It may be actually that some of the investment and reforms that were made in the 2000s will in due course make things better, but it's too early to say. But I do think that it is it is fundamentally wrong to say, we shouldn't worry about inequality because equality of opportunity and social mobility is all that matters, and that will take care of itself. That doesn't work. You have to act on both. Finally, on Greece, something again that I take a considerable interest in. I will not describe Greece as a failure of markets or capitalism. Greece is a combination of a failure of a ruling political elite, which for a very long time ran the country into the ground, combined, that took place over a couple of decades, combined more recently with the complete incoherence and idiocy of policymakers at a European level who are determined to pursue macroeconomic policies that are obviously completely mad for Greece and for the European Union as a whole. That is a failure, but it's not directly, in my view, a failure of markets as such.
There are essentially two reasons why I object to aid. First of all, in line with what this guy in the front said, in principle, I object to the way that it plays out at the moment. And Jonathan will have a chance to come back, no doubt, but this kind of technocratic conception where we, the experts in the West, we will do our randomized controlled trials in some university in Boston, Massachusetts, and we will do the sums, and we will advise you about what is the best policy for you. Even if they get their sums right, which is very doubtful, if you look at what tends to happen, I would say it's still better to let people in those countries decide what kind of policies to follow. And it isn't just advice, it's advice with money attached, which puts pressure on them to pursue particular policies. So even if people in India say, screw it up and get it wrong, that's part of the democratic process, and they learn from that experience. That's what democracy is about. Whereas if you leave it in the hands of technocrats, then you disempower them. You stop them making any kind of real decisions about how to run their lives. Also, in practice, some of the claims that Brian was implying are just outrageous. I'm completely in favour of infant mortality falling. I'm completely in favour of polio falling, all of these kinds of things. But what has really achieved this, it's not really Western aid programmes. If you look at who has been most successful in eradicating poverty, it's been China, which is certainly not a perfect country, but it's basically told the aid agencies to go away. Be careful with my words. Tell them to go away and said, what we will do, we will focus on economic growth. We will try and become a rich country as the West is rich. And it's been the most successful in terms of eradicating, taking hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, certainly if you take the kind of basic level of poverty. So linking the eradication of poverty to economic transformation, because what hasn't been mentioned yet is development. The whole development is out of this discussion. The best way to improve people's welfare, to make them better off, is to have economic growth, to transform the productive capacity of their economies, and then they're perfectly capable of solving all these problems, and in fact that is what happens in real life.
So what were the outrageous claims I made?
Sorry,
well, you were somehow suggesting that the enlightened technocrats that differed in other aid agencies, they were the people who were responsible for improvements in infant mortality and falling polio and all the rest of it. The people in the poor countries aren't capable of doing this themselves.
No, I wasn't suggesting that at all. I was saying that aid has to be administered properly and in consultation with local people. And I talked about the example of UNICEF working in countries and working with people in those countries. And it's a partnership. Of course some aid is administered badly, and of course some aid is a hangover from colonial past. But to suggest that all aid is run by technocrats who don't know what they're talking about is just nonsense. Let me give you an example. I was recently in Sierra Leone, in the south of the country, and I was making a film in a hospital there. It's a hospital that's provided by Médecins Sans Frontières, which is aid. They completely finance it. They work with the government, and the government supplied the building, but MSF completely run this hospital. Now, 1 in 7 women die in childbirth in Sierra Leone, which is a huge amount. It's the worst maternal mortality rate in the world. Were it not for this hospital, in this one region, hundreds of other women would be dying every year. But this hospital does emergency, it practices emergency cesareans, and it helps people who would otherwise have no medical care at all, in pregnancy and childbirth. So there are doctors there from the West. They are working with Sierra Leoneans. They are training them. And it's a real, genuine partnership that's saving lives every day. So would you suggest that that stops? They don't do that?
I broadly agree with Brian on this. I think it's a bit absurd to suggest that by giving aid to India, we're imposing on the Indians. If the Indians didn't want us there, didn't want our money, they're perfectly capable of telling us to shove it, and as said, and they would. They clearly do feel, as a democratic government, both nationally and state local, that they get something useful out of it in development terms. When they stop thinking that, then the aid program will presumably end.
I mean, it's certainly true that the development discussion uses all these languages like partnership and consultation. But I would say it's a very Orwellian partnership where everyone's equal, but some people are more equal than others, and consultation is trying to push people in a different direction. And as for the example of Sierra Leone, I don't think you can actually prove the counterfactual. In other words, I would argue that Western intervention is pushing these countries away from economic development, which I would say objectively is what they need, and economic development would actually put them in a much better position, and has in reality put people in a much better position to build hospitals, build schools, to be better off. That is the reality.
I kind of think a combination of what all you three are talking about. As far as I can see it, it's the aggressive focus on growth, both in the developed world and the developing world, that has kept countries in the developing world in their place. It's the protectionist policies, tariffs, and subsidies that the countries in the developing world can't give their farmers and so on, that means that they can't get the economic growth, that leaves them in need of aid. Because, to be honest, poverty is actually still on the increase in lots of parts of the world. Life expectancy in parts of sub-Saharan Africa has actually fallen in years, in kind of the past few decades. And I think it's the economic structures of the world today that is holding back some countries from fulfilling their potential.
I just wanted to raise this question of levels of inequality rising, and there is a thesis that rising levels of inequality were one of the factors behind the global financial crisis, that because people's living standards, most people's living standards have fallen, their real incomes have not risen, so they've used debt to maintain their living standards. And so the developed world became over-indebted to a great extent. And that was one of the main contributing factors behind the rise, obviously, in the financialization of everything as well, the growth of the financial sector big time. So, and there is obviously, some people say, well, it doesn't matter about inequality because the people with the money will spend that money to create jobs and create wealth. But there's no evidence that they are doing that at all. Otherwise, perhaps we wouldn't have had this, we wouldn't be in the state we are now, and poverty might have been eradicated. Thank you.
Just to go back to aid, since around 2006, the Spanish government, supported by the European Union, has stepped up giving aid to North African countries, Western African countries, in return for those countries preventing their people from migrating to Spain. And I think what's interesting is that the NGOs in Spain have embraced this, and they are using project money to develop projects in rural areas, and they are very much in line with kind of liberal Western preoccupations. So it's developing ecological bread ovens in the rural areas, it's developing the growth of traditional medicinal and herbal plants. And I suppose the main thing is that it's, well, for the Moroccan government, they are looking good by preventing people from migrating, but also it prevents people from moving into the cities of Morocco. In other words, it's keeping people in their place, and surely that's not a good idea.
I just wanted to go back with the example of Brian on Sierra Leone with aid. You said that doctors from the Western world came over to Sierra Leone, and I think that's just showing the problem that's just it's not sorting the underlying problem. That's just the surface. I do agree that obviously it does have a good effect, but how is that going to help in the long term? Having doctors imported over from another country, when actually what you need to do is to be educating and teaching the people that actually do live there to improve, and I think that's holding some sort of control over, just like colonialism did, and to keep that sort of control over the country.
Would you say that the Cuban model of doctors for oil to Venezuela falls in the charity thing? Would you be against that, particularly, Daniel?
I mean, I can't come back in detail on all these specific country things. Obviously, different countries have their own particular challenges and problems they're facing. I think, well, three things very quickly. First of all, aggressive pursuit of growth. I think, if anything, we need more aggressive pursuit of growth. And the problem is that growth, in many respects, is being held up by all sorts of environmental regulations and other kinds of limits. And in fact, if you look at the trends, if you look at life expectancy, which was given as an example, the trend over decades, in fact, is both economic growth on the whole, I would argue not enough, but there has been economic growth, and dramatic improvements in life expectancy. That is the overall trend, certainly on a global level. It may differ from region to region. It may differ in sub-Saharan Africa, precisely, in fact, because it's had problems in the past anyway, generating growth. That I would argue is, in broad terms, why sub-Saharan Africa is in such a mess, because it hasn't been able to generate growth. But the broad trend, I would say, is very clearly growth goes along with improvements in human welfare. On the point at the front about inequality and the economic crisis, I just started an article on this. But my initial reaction is that there is a relationship, but it's not a causal relationship. So it's clear that you did have a widening of inequality in the West, and you did have a crisis. I think those two things are probably not disputed by most people. I just don't think that it's a causal relationship. I think it's more, again, it's another big topic, but I think it's more the underlying economic problems caused the inequality, or caused the inequality to widen, and also caused the crisis. I'll send you a link to my article when I actually write it, but that's my kind of initial thesis on the thing. And finally, on, I think, Brian's slightly disingenuous thing about, of course, I'm in favour of economic growth and in favour of economic development, but I like this other charity stuff as well. I actually watched the trailer to one of his documentaries, or one of the Why Poverty documentaries on solar engineers. And it shows these really, really poor women from 4 different continents who are given basic training to be solar engineers, to put up solar panels and so on. I don't know where the idea from them doing this solar engineer stuff came from. I'm sure it was from some kind of NGO or government initiative. Now, that's fine. I don't criticise the women. They want to make a living. They can harness solar power. That's fine. But that is not development. That's the problem, that development is being confused with these kind of small eco-projects and interfering in family life and interpersonal relations. It's no longer about the economic transformation of society, which is what you have seen in China and certain other countries, but which Western aid is often holding back in other parts of the world.
The film Solar Mamas is nothing to do with me. It's part of part of the Why Poverty series, so I don't know. I haven't seen it, so I don't know much about it. I do know that the scheme to train women to become solar engineers was not started by an NGO. It was started by an Indian man. It does. You describe it as kind of tinkering, and it's all very nice. It can go and make solar power. Of course, if they bring power to their villages, that will possibly help to stimulate economic growth, because, well, for all sorts of obvious reasons, that if people have power for the first time, it opens up all sorts of possibilities. So it can contribute towards economic growth.
On the role of financialization in the crisis, I think I'm probably broadly on the same page as Daniel here in saying that these things are related, but the causal relationships are quite difficult to unpick. Broadly, I would think that the main channel is simply that we had a dysfunctional, very poorly regulated financial sector, which both allowed certain people within these institutions to increase their incomes hugely, which exacerbated inequality, and led to in due course to the crisis, which reduced growth for all of us. Part of that dysfunctionality was that one of the things, but not the only thing, that the people who were running these institutions did wrong was to deliberately market unsuitable financial products to people who couldn't afford them, which may have raised their consumption levels temporarily, but in the end was a major contributor to the crisis, of course. So it's there in part, but I don't think it's by a long way from being the whole story. On growth and welfare, again, I agree on the broad picture with Daniel. On the whole, growth raises living standards, improves welfare, and so on. The places where falls in life expectancy in sub-Saharan Africa have been observed, I believe, are primarily a result of HIV rather than the broader economic context. I mean, I agree entirely that the protectionism on the whole is a bad thing, and certainly the common agricultural policy in particular is a monstrosity, which does do some damage to some developing countries, but it is not actually the main reason for slow development or poverty in sub-Saharan Africa, since, as a matter of fact, most of those countries benefit from most favoured nation and other type of trade preferences. That doesn't mean that it doesn't do a considerable degree of damage both to our own economy and to the world economy, but I wouldn't place the main responsibility for those sub-Saharan African countries that haven't developed rapidly. It's not mostly because of Western protectionism, although that may have made things worse at the margin. Finally, I don't know much about the North African, specifically the Moroccan, but the North African case, but that is actually a very interesting test case, both of aid, but more broadly of the EU's external relations. Here I do actually disagree with Daniel on saying, well, we should simply leave these countries to get on with it. and in particular that we shouldn't interfere with interpersonal family relations, even indirectly. I mean, the fact is that the dysfunctionality of North African economies is closely related to both gender relations in those countries and dysfunctional regulation of labour markets, which has tended to mean that they have little or no formal sector for very large numbers of quite sort of reasonably well-educated university graduates. That in turn leads, of course, to economic pressures at home and migration pressures. So there's a whole mess there that affects those countries and indirectly affects us quite directly as well. Whether the EU's policies on this of attempting to restrict migration by the sorts of aid projects you suggest are sensible, I very much doubt. But that doesn't mean, actually, that the right answer is simply for the Europeans to not do anything at all. I'm sure that would lead over time to a much worse outcome.
I'm sorry, I'd just like to make two small corrections. Firstly, this film, Solar Mamas, is not actually about a useless project at all. Over the years, about 30 years, it's run by something called the Barefoot University in India, and thousands of women have been able, they only take grandmothers, and they've been able to transform their villages by introducing solar panels. It's not a sort of futile NGO effort at all, so you're quite wrong about that. Secondly, I think you're slightly misled about Warren Buffett, whose interest in inequality predates the financial crash. Mr. Buffett thinks, on the whole, that very rich children shouldn't be quite so rich because their parents got rich. But he also thinks there's too much inequality in America. Now, you might ask Warren Buffett how much inequality is too much inequality, but there's another great film about that on Why Poverty, so please watch the series along with Brown's film at the end of November on BBC 4.
Talking about transforming local villages in Western India, I've recently read that what has really changed villages and other countries most is our remittance payments by immigrants who've left their villages and who've gone to perhaps Western countries in bigger cities and have sent money back home. And I think these remittance payments far exceed any form of aid which any Western country has ever paid. So rather than pushing certain projects, might it not be better for us, if we're really serious about aid, to open our borders and support immigration?
I think the reason that we're having this discussion on why poverty isn't history partly has something to do with the type of standards that we have in the UK and the West in general, in terms of the regulations that we have, and that creates a lot of reliance on our country and therefore hinders development and aspiration in other countries. The type of regulations I'm talking about are things like drugs and patents and the difficulties and the red tape and the costs involved in creating drugs and producing them cheaply, for which countries would then be able to provide the type of drug that their people need at a much lower cost, and then there'll be less reliance on aids, etc., and our involvement in other countries. And rather, our regulations tend to favour the large corporations who bring economic growth into our country. And also another type of regulation is the type of way we're pushing towards fair trade foods, and all the regulation involved in being fair trade certified, such as having food organically produced and making sure it's produced in an environmentally friendly way, which then also means that you have a lot more back-breaking work and manual labour involved, which then hinders development and aspiration in those countries as well.
The point about immigrants sending money home, it probably is vastly more than we spend on aid. And I think one myth about aid that we need to nail right now is that it's this huge amount of money flowing out, because it's not actually, in terms of the GDP of a country. In 1970, most countries signed up to providing 0.7% of their income in aid, and only 5 countries in the world have managed that in the last 42 years. So it's not as big an amount as we think. And secondly, can I come back to your point about education? And I entirely agree about Sierra Leone as an example, that it would be better were there Sierra Leonean doctors working in this hospital. Unfortunately, they all come to the West. when they qualify, they come and work over here because they can earn more money. But I do agree entirely that the key to a lot of social ills in places like, and economic ills in places like Sierra Leone is education. And you provide people education, you provide the means whereby people can be educated, and then a lot of other things fall into place.
Yes, I broadly agree with that. On the point about patents and drugs, I think that is quite a serious issue for development. And actually it's a serious issue for economic growth in this country as well. We have unfortunately constructed a patent system which, at least in some areas, has the effect of stifling innovation and hence raising prices rather than the opposite. And reform of that would be good for us as well as good for developing countries. On migration and remittances, I mean the picture is mixed. You can also have remittances if they just go into building houses, as they often do for some countries, aren't an unmixed blessing. But I do think that more broadly, the sorts of connections that migration brings, not just financial flows, but also flows of people, ideas, and ultimately the promotion of trade and economic connections between two countries and two communities is generally beneficial both to developed and developing countries. And so in general, I think the prescription of more openness to migration is both pro-growth here and pro-development in other countries.
Well, I'll just conclude by talking about two different conceptions of development. There's one conception which focuses on, to the extent it talks about the economy, to a very large extent talks about small-scale projects, these solar mamas and so on, and eco projects. And I very specifically said I don't criticise these women for being involved in it. They want to earn a living, they want to bring power to their villages, so I don't criticise them. But when Westerners really promote these kind of ideas and try and push them on poor countries, I think that's a real problem. I think if you watch the Why Poverty programs, I've only seen the trailers because they're not available to the public yet, but as far as I can see, they pretty much give the official view. The launch, I think, had the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations. It's very much the official view of this kind of small-scale development, which also involves very much interference in interpersonal relations. And to give an example of what I mean by that, you know, when they redefine development to mean gender inequality, what they are really talking about is how men in the third world mistreat women in the third world, and that's one of the big problems in relation to development. The alternative view, which is what I'm putting forward, is that the best way to achieve, to improve human welfare, to make people's lives better, is to have development in the sense of transforming, economic transformation, transforming and making economies richer.
Give them a clap. There's plenty to think about. Food for thought.